Why don't we get started with our third session of the day, and I think we're in for a real treat here, but once again, we're going to have this third session introduced by a student, a Stanford undergraduate named, and I hope I don't mangle the pronunciation, but I'll try, Andrew Dallakoti. Kind of, yeah, okay. And Andrew is the Director of Technology for Stanford and Government. He's class of 2020, so a sophomore. He interned for the political think tank, the Centennial Institute in 2014. And this summer, Andrew earned a fellowship for El Paso, a nonprofit aiming to close the education achievement gap among Latino students in Boulder, Colorado. He's also passionate about environmental issues, attending a sophomore college seminar in Tanzania. Andrew is undeclared, but is considering majors in mathematics and biomedical computation. Why not economics? Have you taken Econ 1 yet? Additionally, Andrew serves as the assistant financial officer on Stanford's debate team. So please join me in welcoming Andrew to be our moderator for this third session.
Hello, everyone. As Mark said, I'm Andrew, and I'm an undergraduate at Stanford. I'm so honored for the opportunity to moderate this discussion featuring two distinguished individuals in the fields of education and, more specifically, educational equity. This summer, as Mark brought up, I was honored to have the fellowship opportunity to actually study this issue in Boulder County, so you can imagine how excited I am to take the discussion to the experts through this moderated discussion. Our first speaker is going to be Diane Whitmore Schanzenbach. She's the Margaret Walker Alexander Professor of Human Development and Social Policy, as well as the Director of the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern University. Professor Schanzenbach studies policies aimed at improving the lives of children in poverty, including education, health, and financial support policies. Her recent work is focused on tracing the impact of major public policies such as the food stamp program and early childhood education on children's long-term outcomes. She's also currently studying the impacts of the recent wave of school finance reforms that are aimed to allocate more resources towards low-income school districts. If we want to give it up to her real quick. After her presentation, we're going to hear from Reid Saaris. He has several awards to his names, including the Stanford Social Innovator Fellow, the Draper Richards Kaplan Fellow, and most recently, the New Schools Venture Fund Entrepreneur of the Year. Most notably, he is the founder and CEO of Equal Opportunity Schools. EOS is a nonprofit that collaborates with school districts to increase equitable enrollment in AP and IB classes. Mr. Saaris is a graduate of Stanford's joint degree program between the Graduate School of Business and the Graduate School of Education, so I want to personally welcome him back to the forum. We're excited to have a Stanford alum among us today, and we're really excited to have both of you speak for us.
Thank you.
Now for Diane.
Thank you. It's terrific to be here. Like I said, I'm Diane Schanzenbach, and I'm giving you an overview of some facts about the education gap. I'll talk a little bit about some of my work, but also draw on work by many other people. So you can especially question me about that, because I won't be defensive about any of it. I wanted to make sure to not just talk about one type of education gap. So we have education gaps across race and ethnic group. We have education gaps, again, across socioeconomic status and so on. And so I didn't want to show you everything cut one way, because what you'll see in this, as many of you know, we are experiencing tremendous education gaps across almost any way you slice and dice the data. And this is a pressing social concern. So I wanted to start off by just documenting that the attainment gap is very large. And so by attainment gap, we mean sort of the number of years or credentials that someone gets. As was talked about over lunch, we've seen that there has been some closing of the attainment gap, but there are still large gaps that remain. On the left-hand side here, this is the share of 25 to 29-year-olds with a high school diploma broken out by racial and ethnic groups in 2012 and 2017. And so what you can see is back in 2002, there were large gaps. 93% of whites graduated from high school, 88% of African Americans did, and the Hispanic rate was down. Less than 2/3 of Hispanics graduated with a high school diploma. Over the subsequent 15 years, we've seen Hispanics have really gained tremendously. Everyone has been more likely to graduate with a high school diploma, and Hispanics have really started to close that gap, but it is far from perfect. There's still a large gap that remains. On the right-hand side, we have the same type of graph, but it's the share of 25 to 29-year-olds with a bachelor's degree. And again, you can see over this 15-year period from 2002 to 2017, a large increase in attainment across all groups, especially among Hispanics, but still large and persistent gaps between whites and blacks, whites and Hispanics. Breaking this up by income, we see something similar. So that we see that high-income students are much more likely to attain a college degree. So what we have here is children by families' income quartile. And there's two sets of bars here. The first in blue is the college degree attainment rate for students who were born around 1962. On top of that is layered the rate, the increase that we saw for people who were born around 1980. So you can see a number of things. For one, everyone saw an increase in attainment of college degrees. The top half of the income distribution, that highest quartile and the third quartile, saw particularly large increases. And in fact, even though there's been some growth among the lowest quartile, the gaps there are very large, and there's just a long, long way to go. In addition, especially here at Stanford, I wanted to point out that low-income students are much less represented at more selective colleges. So you can see we've got bottom quartile and top quartile students here. Starting on the left, no post-secondary. Of course, low-income kids are more represented in that group. And then as we march across from community college to less non-competitive colleges to competitive and so on, we see those gaps reverse. And today, child who goes from one of the top, most wealthy families is 14 times more likely to attend a competitive college than someone from a low-income family. Second, so that was the attainment gap. Next, we'll talk about the achievement gap, which is test scores. Again, sort of no matter how we slice and dice these data, they're going to sort of tell the same type of story. Sometimes there's more progress than others. But by and large, just the gaps are very large. So this is the National Assessment of Education Progress, the nation's report card. It's called the NAEP data. So this is the average reading scores in grade 4. Starting in 1992, going across to the most recent data. And what you can see is the top line here is white students. Black and Hispanic students are the two lower lines. You can see that Hispanic students actually are slightly edging out African American students. There was some progress in terms of narrowing the achievement gap in the 90s, but that seems to have mostly stalled. And so we are seeing sort of slow increase in average test scores, very slow, painfully slow, and those have basically been moving in parallel, in tandem. We haven't been seeing that close at the same time. This is what test scores look like for mathematics, and I point out that at 2015 is the first time we saw a statistically significant decline in national test scores. So you can see that over at the end. And again, you see there was certainly some progress, slow progress in the 90s and early 2000s, and that seems to have really stalled out. There is some upward progress in terms of average test scores, but not really that narrowing of the test score gap. We can turn a little bit. Instead of just looking at average test scores, we can see what's the share of students who are meeting some level of proficiency. And I've broken this up by students who are eligible versus ineligible for free and reduced price lunch. And what you can see here is many things. First, starting in 1996, very few children were proficient on the NAEP test scores. That we've seen a big increase in that over the 2000s and up to today, but still today, only about 1/4 of low-income students score proficient on the NAEP math test. This compares to about 60% of children who are ineligible for free reduced price lunch. These are large gaps and just unacceptably low performance levels. This is, I'm sure, familiar to many of you because it's very influential work by Stanford's own Sean Reardon. And it's looking at the achievement gap between the wealthiest, children from the wealthiest families at the 90th percentile and children from the poorest families at the 10th percentile. And he did a tremendous amount of work to trace this back all the way to students who were born in 1943 to about the year 2000. Now, Mackie made fun of standard deviations earlier today. I don't know why people don't like standard deviations. I know, so I'm talking to the nerds on this one. All right, so this is in standard deviation units. What we can see is there was sort of a slow increase that was mostly flat in the 1950s, 60s, and so on. But then since, over my lifetime, since about 1970, we've seen a large increase in that 90-10 income distribution achievement gap, such that it increased by 40% over the last 45 years. It's a tremendous increase. Next, again, I'm just one more for the real nerds in the group. What I've drawn here is a set of distributions of 8th grade test scores by race. And so you can see really the whole distribution, what share of students score below 110, 145, and so on. So what you can see across both of these, this is reading on the left-hand side, math on the right-hand side, is that the distribution for white students is all shifted to the right, which means that they're scoring higher. So you can see sort of the point that's highest is approximately the median here. Whites have higher median scores than Hispanics or African Americans. There are many more Hispanics and African Americans in the lower tail. And if you want to think about a place like Stanford, we might think about you can only come to Stanford if your test scores are above a certain threshold that's very high. You can see that there are just many, many more white students who score above a very high threshold than African Americans and Hispanics. In order to address issues like too many children performing very badly and sort of being sucked into the criminal justice system, and on the other side, not enough diverse students coming to places like Stanford, we really need to see the entire distribution of test scores get shifted over. The next set of information that I wanted to share is how gaps change across ages of students. I wanted to start off by noting that these differences do not appear to be innate. So what I have here is the distribution of test scores of 9-month-old children by socioeconomic status, so by family's economic quintile. What you can see is there's no gradient here at all. There's nothing measurably different between the lowest 9-month-olds and and 9 months olds from the highest earning families. Now, this is not because this is not a good test. This is not because there's a lack of variation, because in fact we can see other things predict test scores on this. So we can see that an additional month of age leads to a big increase in this measure of 9-month-old mental function. Females, on average, score higher on this. This is a test that is meaningful. This is clearly a study done by a firstborn, because they also find that second-born children are a little bit less well scoring on this. The point of this is to note that there's no difference. These are at age 9 months. These do not appear to be innate differences. This is something that we're doing to the children. So in particular, I'll show you this next graph, which is how the black-white achievement gap grows across ages. So we start over here at 9 months, where there's no difference. The light green, or I guess lime-colored bars, show these differences without any statistical controls for anything else. And so by 2 years, you can see it's a large 0.4 standard deviation difference between blacks and whites in terms of average achievement. That increases by the time the kid gets to kindergarten. It's 0.6 of a standard deviation. It continues to grow through first grade, and then more or less levels off to between 0.7 and 0.8 standard deviations. These are very, very large differences. These darker colored bars show what the gap looks like when we control for observable characteristics that can be observed at kindergarten entry. So that's differences in socioeconomic status, in parental investments that can be measured at kindergarten entry, other things like that. And it takes away some of the black-white achievement gap, but it's still there. It is still quite large. So the black-white achievement gap grows as children age, and much of it is not explained by observable characteristics. To sort of finish up, I wanted to talk a little bit about the economic impacts of these gaps. So I'm a labor economist, and many of those of us in this literature are labor economists by training, and so we're very interested in achievement gaps and attainment gaps, not for their own sake, but because of what they mean for tomorrow's economy. So to start, I'll point out that without a college degree, kids who grow up poor are very unlikely to leave the lowest quintile in terms of their own adult earnings. So what we have here is we've broken up children by, we're looking at children who grew up in the bottom income quintile. Then we want to see what's the likelihood that when they grow up, they stay in the bottom quintile or move up to the second, middle, fourth, or fifth quintile. So this is the people who are most economically successful among children who grew up low income. And what we see here is that children who did not go on to get a college degree with this sort of teal-colored bar are much, much, much more likely to stay in the lowest quintile themselves as they hit adulthood, and are very unlikely to grow up to be in the top income quintile. On the other hand, if they do attain a college degree, their chances of attaining the highest quintile in earnings or the second quintile, so we're really making the American dream, is much, much higher. So without a college degree, a low-income kid has very little chance of upward mobility. Similarly, I think what we need to be talking much, much more about as a nation is the fact that the United States has declining labor force participation rates. So this shows the probability that an individual has a job at all from 1962 up through today. What you can see is a couple of things. We've seen a slow and steady decline among men's labor force participation over the last 50 years. Among women in the 60s and 70s and 80s, we saw strong increases in women's labor force participation, and that has turned back downward in the year 2000. The United States is somewhat unique among all OECD countries in this pattern. In particular, no other OECD country is seeing women's labor force participation drop like this. And today, the United States has lower women's labor force participation than Japan and many other nations. On the other hand, when we look at men, we are leading the pack, or we're in the top couple of countries in terms of men dropping out of the labor force. This is bad news for the future of our economy. If people are not engaged in the labor force, our economy will grow less quickly, and there are all sorts of other problems that come from that. What we know is that not attaining some college is one of the primary predictors of dropping out of the labor force. So here, what I'm showing you is the share of people who are dropped out of the labor force, unemployed, or employed by gender, and then also by educational attainment. What you can see here is men and women who have high school diploma or less are much more likely to be out of the labor force. And as we march over toward the right with higher and higher levels of education, to be sure, women are always more likely to be out of the labor force, but both men and women participate more if they have higher levels of education. As we move forward in the economy, we know that we're going to be experiencing a time of extreme disruption. Jobs are going to disappear, new jobs are going to come all the time. What we need to be concerned about is making sure that our population has appropriate skills to adapt to a changing economy and to be able to continue to find jobs. What should make us gravely concerned is the number of people with low levels of education dropping out of the labor force, and the fact that large numbers of them are African American, Hispanic, from low-income families, and so on. Just to finish up, I want to talk a little bit more about the future of work in tomorrow's economy. And so what we know from a lot of economic research is that both cognitive skills and non-cognitive skills are important for predicting earnings. And we learned a little bit over lunch that we've done a lot in terms of improving students' cognitive test scores, but we might have been sort of giving short shift to people's non-cognitive skills, especially under high-stakes accountability. And that's starting to shift under the Every Student Succeeds Act. On the left here, I'm showing you a graph of the relationship between cognitive skills and earnings, and also non-cognitive skills and earnings. And what you can see, cognitive skills are the green here, non-cognitive are the bluer. There's an upward sloping relationship between both of them, and there's larger returns at the tails for people who have high levels of especially cognitive skills, but also non-cognitive skills. I want to point out here on the right-hand side, we can look at the relationship between an individual's cognitive skills and their own non-cognitive skills, right? So of course they are also upward, sloping. They're positively related to each other, but it's much less strongly related. So what we end up seeing is a lot of people who have high levels of cognitive skills and lower levels of non-cognitive skills, and vice versa. I imagine you may not be able to relate to this because at Stanford, we typically see people who are really good at both types of skills. They're both good with numbers and good with people. But I can tell you that in a regression framework, we're trying to explain test scores with non-cognitive skills, with these people skills. We can only explain about 13% of the variation in the one controlling for the other. So they're positively related. They're both extremely important. Our best estimate of what jobs in the future are going to require is a lot of both. So we need to make sure that we can close the gap not only in terms of cognitive skills, but also in non-cognitive skills, because what we think is tomorrow's jobs are going to be going to people who not only can do math and higher order of reasoning, but also can get along with other people, because that's something that robots aren't particularly able to do. I'll leave it at that. In the Q&A time, I'd be happy to talk a little bit about what some of the research says about other ways that we know how to close these gaps. Thanks a lot.
Can folks hear me here? As we get this set up, I wanted to take a moment you're going to do a turn and talk with your partner on a quick question. We'll do about a minute. But we've been talking about gaps all morning. We've been talking about achievement, attainment, college going, what are charters doing. And in every session, I think we've heard questions from folks trying to peel back the onion on what works, what doesn't work. And so as we go into this next section here, I want you to take a minute with a partner on the question of what do you think is a top cause of the achievement gaps that we're seeing, these persistent gaps by income, by race? What do you think of as a top cause for that? So take a minute with a partner. We'll hear from a few folks before we dive into the presentation. All right, we'll take about 10 seconds to wrap up. All right, let's hear from a few folks around the room. And there is research coming. We do have a sense of the things that do drive achievement at the levels needed to get college degrees and things like that. But what are some of the things that come to your mind initially in thinking about this topic? Key causes or lead drivers for persistent gaps in achievement. Yeah. Okay, so power, vested interest, preserve the status quo. Great. Other thoughts? Yeah. Opportunities. Great. Take 2 or 3 other thoughts. Yeah.
Segregated housing, they practice.
Housing, segregation.
Schools are designed in the 19th century, have to be redesigned for the 21st century, a very different population demographic than we have today.
Old style of schooling. Yeah.
Public school funding being linked to property taxes.
Public school funding being linked to property taxes. Great, so that's sort of an income piece there and how schools are funded. And last one over here, Anne Marie.
I think adults in schools see kids and their potential really different.
Views of students that Ryan talked about a little bit earlier. Great. So you guys are obviously really smart. Some of the audiences I talk to really go down the road of students' income, or these things at early grades that you'll never recover from, or preschool. The sense of who belongs where. Some students are so damaged that they couldn't possibly do amazing things. This sort of student-focused view of achievement gap that I want to talk about as really bringing together, and would encourage us, as many of you already do, but would encourage everyone to think about always using the term opportunity gap when you talk about an achievement gap. I think oftentimes the concept of achievement gap standing by itself can be about thinking about a student as a low achiever versus thinking about the set of opportunities that you all talked about around the room that really are underpinning and creating and reproducing the achievement gap on a yearly basis. So this is my best friend, Jamie. We grew up and did everything together in our childhoods until this moment in high school when kids get assigned to classes on one side of the hallway that'll get them ready for college, or they get something else on the other side. And my mom happened to have been a career school counselor, and so she said, Reid, right this way to get ready for college and Stanford and all sorts of great things in my life. Jamie's mom had dropped out of school after 8th grade, was a single mom raising 5 kids, and so not only did she not have the chance to experience high school herself, she didn't have the time to help Jamie figure out how to navigate it. So our opportunity set was fundamentally different in our lives. And in his words, he spent the past now almost 2 decades trying to make up for what was lost at that juncture in our lives. And it's been my passion and professional obsession to ensure that nobody goes missing from the set of opportunities that will enable the achievement that can open doors for the future. So we'll talk for a moment about some of the stakes here. Folks have talked about these in different ways throughout, but I want to take it even one level deeper. There's the economic piece that we know. A permanent national recession deeper than the Great Recession, which we just went through, is seen by McKinsey and Company as the result of the achievement gap. So this is some of the American dream pursuit of happiness things. How are we doing on an economic basis? But it also talks about the achievement gap also affects other aspects of the American dream, life and liberty, as well as the pursuit of happiness. When we think about where students belong, what sort of opportunities they deserve, that connects intimately with things like the school-to-prison pipeline. And when students aren't ready for the modern economy, where we have a huge deficit of workforce prepared for college-level jobs, that's actually the gap, is not enough people prepared for college-level jobs in all the labor market forecasts. People have to go somewhere. And so each year, we continue with a system of mass incarceration that vastly disproportionately affects students in a way that mirrors strongly the achievement gap data that we see. And so the schools to prison pipeline, I think, gets to the very heart of liberty as well as the pursuit of happiness, and even affects life and how we think of different lives, the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, and other factors. So I think it is on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, back to the economic piece of it at an individual level rather than an economy-wide level. You're looking at something like 2 times as much earnings in a lifetime as a result of a college degree. My college advisor wrote this great book called Voice and Equality. He measured the sense of the sort of volume of somebody's voice in democratic society. The greater your voice, the greater your influence over systems, policies, government, and things that affect your life on a daily basis, and looked at how unequal voice was by race and income groups. In my thesis, I really traced that back to the core underlying principle that's actually determining political voice in society is education. And so I think that you just wanted to broaden out sort of how we're thinking about the stakes of educational achievement and opportunity gaps. And then it was talked about in terms of the California context, zooming out to the national context. It is true that students of color are in fact the majority of the US K-12 school population, and will continue to be an ever larger majority by all forecasts in the years ahead. So a persistent and continued failure to provide equitable opportunities to learn and achieve college degrees is going to have increasing consequences with every passing year. And so this, back to this idea of really going beneath the achievement gap to the opportunity gap. There is no achievement gap without discussing opportunity. Opportunity precedes and makes achievement possible. So another student example, this was a student of mine in Beaufort, South Carolina, where I taught and was an administrator. And you could look at Carl's achievement. He had a 1.7 GPA. He was in the lowest level courses in the high school where I taught. I happened to be his coach and for cross-country running and soccer and other things, and found him just fascinated with all sorts of interesting topics, wanting to debate and discuss how would we think about this, how would we prove that, how would we do this, how would we do that. If you think in terms of the achievement gap, you say, well, Carl's a low achiever. If you think in terms of the opportunity gap, as we did at that school, ended up moving Carl from the lowest level courses to the highest level courses in the school. This was a school with a quarter-mile long hallway that divided two systems. Even though the Beaufort County schools had been desegregated at the school level, it was segregated and divided by this long hallway, where on one side of the hallway you could see a 12th grade English class playing an all-class game of hangman, and the teacher saying, who wants to guess the next letter? And on the other side, kids reading books and debating and discussing really interesting and fascinating issues. You think in terms of achievement gap, you think, well, what's wrong with Carl? You think in terms of opportunity gap, you have to move Carl up and give him great opportunities. So we upgraded him to all the toughest courses in the school, and he graduated ready for college instead of on the educational off-ramps, and saw it as the chance of a lifetime, and one that not many people get when we talk about persistent opportunity gaps throughout our country. The school I was at also sort of, again, for sort of achievement versus opportunity, you walked into this building, and actually on the right, the first thing you saw was this big glass enclosure, and it was elevated, and there was about 10 different sort of seats up in there elevated, and they were all security officers, including armed police officers, with this notion of this is the type of students we have here, this is the type of environment and places that they belong, and the opportunities we have will be the opportunities to interact with law enforcement, opportunities to try to be engaged with staying out of trouble and these sorts of things. I lobbied unsuccessfully to get that enclosure changed to really be all about the advanced coursework opportunities we had, college and things like that. And then, I should introduce it. It's going to play, it's a video here to give you an example of a student where the focus is really on the opportunity, because this student comes up in a system like the one I taught in, and then happened to transfer into a different system that changed the set of opportunities. So this is Joe to see.
There are people out there who have a lot to offer the world, but they're never given that fair chance to challenge themselves academically to do what they're capable of. In middle school, I was very shy. I didn't want to interact with other students. I wore a hoodie in 96-degree weather just because I wanted to create a barrier between myself and the rest of the world. When I transferred here, I sat down with my counselor. He noticed that I'd always had good grades. He recommended taking harder classes. Some of these students, they're excelling in these easier classes. Our staff takes the initiative to challenge these children to take harder classes that could benefit them. My junior year, I took AP Chemistry, which is a class that seniors take. I was the youngest student in the district to take the class, and I passed it. Senior year, I took AP Comparative Politics. It wasn't so easy as it was before, but when I got into the AP classes, I found I have the potential to do a lot more than what I've been doing in the past. My plans for the future, I'm going to be attending college at Pacific Lutheran University. I plan to major in chemical engineering. These advanced placement courses has allowed me to come out of my shell. I'd still be that shy guy if it weren't for Federal Way and faculty to support me and push me and let me know that I'm capable of doing so much more.
So it really gives you a sense of the opportunity gap in thinking about a student in one context who puts up a hood because the school doesn't see him, doesn't respect him, doesn't recognize him for who he is, changes into a system that fundamentally sees opportunity differently and immediately reaches out to him and says, what areas are you passionate about? We're going to get you in the most challenging classes. Jodeci takes off his hood, becomes class president, is now finishing up his college degree, and in the video you saw his brother who was sitting there looking up to him and following in his footsteps. So just to put it a little bit in context, just mentioned some of the significant implications. It's health, wealth, it's political voice. It's all these really significant things, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness at the top here, the American dream, and achievement. And we can talk a lot about achievement gaps, and what I'm encouraging us to continue to do here is to always talk about the opportunity gaps that create the achievement gaps that we see. So one framework for thinking about this is what types of opportunity gaps are there. There's a few major types that are really well documented, including by the Education Trust that Ryan represented here earlier. The spending gap is roughly nationally, depending on whether you're looking at race or income, $1,200 to $2,000 difference in spending per student based on race and based on income. So looking at the per pupil spending for particularly Black and Latino students and seeing a persistent underinvestment in the education of those students. And this is true, by the way, even when you look within a district. So you can say, well, we have the propositions and the property taxes and the state things that you can't fix all of that. But this is true even within districts. Within districts, school district officials consistently and reliably spend less money on their students on their schools that have more students of color and low-income students. That's within their budget and their discretion. They're not hampered by state policy, but they continually underinvest in certain communities. And teachers, depending again on what you're looking at, there's variation in the number, but low-income students and students of color across the nation about twice as likely to receive novice teachers, substantially more likely to receive teachers who are out of their field area of study, who don't have majors in the subject, et cetera. So these are decisions made every day at the policy level and at the local level to deploy resources differently to students by race and income. And then the curriculum gap piece here, when I asked the question earlier about what drives the achievement and attainment gap, this is research out of the US Department of Education, suggests that academic intensity in high school, the opportunity to experience rigorous learning opportunities, which is supposed to be what school is all about, drives college completion more than any other factor. More than a student's income level, more even than their 8th grade test scores. You might think, well, everything's baked and done by the time a student hits 8th grade. It's not the case. If you provide an academically intense set of high school learning opportunities, you'll see college completion go up substantially. So that's where Equal Opportunity Schools, the organization I found and run, focuses. This is a national gaps chart. We published some of the earlier data from years prior to this. It's my one squint chart for you guys to sort of see the detailed data in a complex way. So what this shows here is it's double disaggregation by race and income. I think it's important to look at those things. Sometimes people will say it's one or the other, but disaggregating by both, you can see patterns across the data. And what you see here, as one example, African American students consistently less than half as likely to participate in AP and IB courses, college level learning experiences in high school getting that academic intensity. We found that this is not a result of schools with predominantly students of color not having these programs, The programs exist in the schools where 90% of our students go to school, and this is about decisions within the building on a daily basis about who gets access to those opportunities and why. And San Jose Unified School District. I worked with this district when I was here at Stanford. I would ride the Caltrain down every day. I was still learning how to use Excel and figure out how data works, manipulating data and putting together PowerPoints, and ultimately helping them on those dashed lines of what we call missing students, say, who are those students in that gap? What do we know about them? Who could talk to them? What could we do? And what we saw here is and by the way, this pattern was representative of 99% of diverse high schools in the US. So that means almost any school around here that you want to walk into, you will walk down a diverse hallway and you'll take a right-hand turn into the AP or IB classroom, and you'll see a lot of that diversity fall away. 99% of diverse schools face these types of gaps in the US, opportunity gaps in access to rigor. And what we saw a year later was that they were able to join that 1% of schools. This is a district-wide data chart, actually, one of the largest systems to have ever closed these gaps. Fully reflect the diversity and talent of their students at the highest levels. Some may say, well, putting kids in a class in high school, does that make any sense? What about these earlier achievement gaps? Can kids do it? What we found is that the pass rate on the AP and IB tests went up when we did this. This was the same thing that happened in South Carolina. The pass rates went up substantially when we closed the access gaps. And even more exciting, I think, is that educators love doing this work. So the principal of one of the schools that got all this data and coaching work for me said it was the highlight of her career to stop talking about discipline and dropout and failure and these sorts of things and start talking about great opportunities for students. Do folks know the aspiration rate in terms of the percent of schools, students who want to go to college? I hear very hesitant murmurings out there. So it's not it's again to this achievement versus opportunity gap. It's not on the student. 90% of students want to go to college. 90% of parents expect their students to go to college. This doesn't vary significantly by race or income. The aspirations are there. We saw some things earlier about the degree attainment rate that folks may remember. Closer to around 30% of students actually persevering to obtain a degree within 6 years of graduating high school. So this huge gulf that I'm making the case really comes back to the opportunity gap. And so knowing that academic intensity in high school is such a significant factor, we ask in surveys of well over 1 million students now across the country, are you challenged by your classes? And we see the answer to that question is very close to the college completion rate. So, so you're seeing 70% or so nationally of students not being challenged by their classes, and especially severe for students of color, not in advanced high school classes. 86% not being challenged by their classes. And to think of that in the context of some of the conversations that we have about what students might or might not be able to do, why are they not achieving, what's going on here, what can we do differently. There are a lot of complexities in charter school management and all of these other issues, but if this proportion of students are showing up every day in order to get ready for college and are not being challenged by their classes, they're not receiving the basic opportunities needed to do that, that's something that we can really sink our teeth into and begin to change. So peel back a little bit further here in terms of how those opportunity gaps play out in a school. We're seeing that students by race and income have different levels of information about programs like AP and IB. So this would be low-income students, Latino students, African American students, have hugely different sense of the information needed to participate in these programs, encouragement to participate in advanced programs, similar gulfs in encouragement. You may find at a given school white and Asian middle and upper income students being 4 times as likely to be encouraged by an adult in their school to participate in advanced courses, and very different sense of belonging and who belongs there. Across our whole portfolio of work, we see in 75% of cases that when you close these access gaps, when you close those opportunity gaps, the success rates are stable or increase. So in other words, the quality doesn't decline. It's not that students can't handle it. It's not that they're going to water it down. Students, as Jaime Escalante said, will rise to the level of expectations. This is our team. It's a tremendous group of people. Just was going to show you a few things about the sense of movement that's developed around this particular opportunity gap. An incredible set of folks that we work with, a lot of whom are from Stanford, an incredible set of donor partners that work with us, and an incredible set of information. So this is from the data standpoint to some of the questions people were asking about that earlier. Typically, you may look at this amount of data to see a student and see their achievement, and instead of opportunity preceding achievement, using achievement data to determine opportunity. So we know this student has such and such a GPA, such and such a writing score, math score, critical reading score. Maybe they're not really ready for advanced courses. What we do at Equal Opportunity Schools is we fill in the broader set of data that really relates to this student. So you find out that she wants to be the first in her family to complete college, and that she was bullied early in high school and had low grades as a result of that. She has 4 adults who think she's ready for advanced courses, and all sorts of other factors that really put her in a good position to that, but no one's ever talked to her about it. So we can go and use that data to close an opportunity gap. We've been working with the ideas here at Stanford on sense of belonging. Claude Steele, who's a pioneer in that field. We've been working with the Pertz Center on activating growth mindset and student belonging. I have to give thanks to the Rakes Foundation for their generous support of our work in this area. They're here with us today. And then been featured recently in a book and a Stanford Social Innovation Review article as having a really strong strategy as an organization to get this type of work done. We made a commitment to find 100,000 missing students over a 3-year period with the College Board and IB, recognized by the former US Secretary of Education and the White House for this work. So all that's we have state commitments to become the first states in the US to ever close these access gaps. And fully reflect student diversity at the highest levels of K-12. But all of that is to say, as I wrap up here, opportunity gaps are a great place to focus because they're concrete. I would encourage folks, as you think about research, as you think about practice, to make things concrete. A gap in a percent and this and that is actually a set of students, and so that's why we talk about 750,000 missing students each year. An achievement gap is this abstract thing. An opportunity gap is a set of changes for a set of individuals that can be made on the ground. And so I think that's powerful, but it's also a tangled web that any practitioners in the room will certainly well appreciate. I've been frustrated, I think, also by the lack of progress. Even though we've moved quickly, we still have well over 500,000 students each year who are stuck in that position of being literally across the hall from the opportunity they need and deserve. The data seems really clear. The support we've gained is significant. But this is there's a school not too far from here that I wanted to work with for many years, and they have one of the most segregated advanced programs in the entire US. And worked over many years, got together a group of funders, got together the district people from the board, people from the university, and we said, can we tackle this opportunity gap within your system? And they said, well, we need to work on people getting into 9th grade first because there's a lot of work to do there. Okay, I'll come back in 2 years when the kids are in 11th grade. Okay, well, I'm not sure we're ready. Okay, we got the resources. Okay, we'll try it. And worked with this system for years, and ultimately came down to a meeting with myself and the superintendent and a member of the board of directors, a stack of those student insight cards that I showed you. We said at this particular high school there are 300 missing students who deserve this opportunity. We have 80% of the staff at that school that thinks it's important to close this gap. All of the students in this list are being recommended by teachers to do this work. It was a 2-hour meeting, the superintendent, all sorts of these reasons here and there, and I said, I don't understand. We have the will of the staff, we have the data on the students, we have funders ready to support this, I got your board member here. What else do you need in order to create this set of opportunities? And his answer was time. And it's the same answer that confronted desegregationists in the South, and otherwise this notion of, actually changing how we allocate opportunities, it's just gonna take longer. And so that school, very close by, remains pretty fully segregated internally to this day, despite all the evidence and momentum to the contrary. So as I mentioned before, thanks for having me. Thank you very much for listening to the talk, but encourage people to think about achievement gap in policy and economics, but also in the context of what's specific, what's concrete, what's local. These gaps in opportunities that create those are as close to you as the nearest high school and only as wide as that hallway. And the more that in our research and in our practice, we can take it out of the sort of nebulous sense of this huge set of things that we couldn't possibly, and call it what it is in terms of a number of students, a set of opportunities, because the future is really going to be determined in those classrooms for us. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you guys for talking. That was really enjoyable. I have some questions for each of you, but feel free to bounce in, and we can just have a pretty natural conversation if it becomes that. So, during actually the first minute of your speech, when we had some time to talk to our partners, we were discussing how a lot of times it seems that the data shows that there's opportunity gap, or at least the roots of it show up when you're 2 to 6 years old. And considering this is a forum on K through 12 education, what should the school system do, Diane, in your opinion, to mitigate some of these opportunity gaps, given that we already kind of see them day one of kindergarten?
Yeah, I think that there's good evidence that we can do many things, not just in early life, although early life is for sure important, and not just in kindergarten or in preschool, but all the way up through high school and so on, to help close this gap. I don't think we really know how to stop the gap from opening in the first place without sort of major change in sort of how society is structured. But I think that for a while there were many, at least economists, who thought sort of game over by age 6, and so we really have to focus on early life. And I think that we no longer think that. I think that there's good opportunities for strong investments that will do much to close and narrow the achievement gap sort of throughout life.
Nice. And Rita, we'll get back to the education piece in a second, but I know that there are a lot of students in this room that have entrepreneurial aspirations, and a lot of that is geared towards social goods. I have a 2-part question for you. One, do you have any advice for students like me that are wanting to take an idea into execution? And 2, what was your motivation for creating your own independent nonprofit rather than working within existing structures to create this change?
That's a great question. I guess it's advice and the sort of in and out of system question at the same time, but I found that being around other movement leaders and a part of other work was critical. So was teaching at a public school in South Carolina for several years, an administrator there, and then was actually incubated out of the Education Trust. So I said, we found something interesting. What are others doing? How does this work? And got the opportunity to embed. So I think that's a strategy for students to think about if you're going to build something. Embed with people who are already doing this work, can give you office space, access to their researchers, access to their communications people, wisdom about what's working and not. They can pay to turn on the lights and all that stuff, and you can think about it and work on your idea. So that was really powerful for me, and informed and framed a lot of what we do as an organization. And then, I think there has been a lot of talk recently about, particularly in the social sector, about this notion of an entrepreneur going off and doing amazing things on their own and creating this great idea and that sort of thing. And I think that can be the case, but much more so it's about linking up with social movements and building on the work of others. And so we've already linked arms with the College Board and IB who run these programs, worked with the U.S. Department of Education and lots of others. So I think starting by seeing yourself as a part of something bigger and embedding on a practical level to get resources, ideas, and insights, but then as you're continuing the work, also seeing how you interconnect with and can amplify the work through really tight partnerships with others, because there is no sort of go off and do it on your own sort of option if you want to create broad-based social impact.
And in the first few minutes of your presentation, you kind of canvassed the room and got a really wide array of the different types of problems we see in education that could lead to this like opportunity gap. And throughout today's sessions, we've talked about school finance reform as you've researched, early education, teacher quality, accountability policies. From each of you, has one emerged as a better solution towards addressing these achievement disparities, or it's probably going to be a combination of multiple, but is there one that's more prominent than the rest?
Boy, we've got lots and lots of studies of all sorts of interventions across all sorts of different areas, and I think that among ones that where there's evidence that they work, and that includes high quality teachers, it includes class size reduction, it includes increasing pre-K, all sorts of things. None of them really crush it, right? Everything sort of helps a little bit. On the margin, and so then we have to start thinking about, well, how do we layer these things on, or where do we think about costs and benefits? But hearing Reid's presentation made me think about an example that I have from Evanston, which is where Northwestern University is, and we at Northwestern have a partnership with the local school district where we provide evaluation services for the district. And a few years ago, they did sort of exactly what Reid was talking about. They decided, we live in a very diverse community that's divided among socioeconomic lines and racial lines, so we're going to really increase the number of African Americans and low-income kids who are taking AP courses. So they let this run for a couple of years, and then they brought in the nerds to say, okay, what is this doing for us? And what we found was really astonishing. Not only did it help all these people who now had access to APs, but it didn't hurt any of the other people, right? So it wasn't that this watered down the curriculum or somehow harmed folks. It was really just a win-win. And I think that things like that, that seem to actually cost not that much in terms of resources, are the right things to do, and then we can evaluate and really measure that, are pretty promising.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, and I just, I mentioned some of the funding gap figures and curriculum gap and teacher gap, and I think they're all significant, but it's amazing how seldom we talk about that. We've had so many conversations in the past decade about the achievement gap, and so few conversations about how we consistently underinvest financially with high quality teachers and with great curricular opportunities. And so I think those are great. Obviously, we focus on the curriculum one, knowing that that's really significant and an ability to shift how people are thinking about where students belong with existing resources in place.
I was wondering, because we have this opportunity to talk to someone that does research and then someone who's like a practitioner in the field. What are your thoughts on standardized testing? Because I'm sure it provides a lot of data for you. Mm-hmm. I want to know what you think about it from your end as well.
I think sort of moving forward, what we've seen happen over the last maybe 15 or 20 years in terms of education research is much better and stronger connections with practitioners. And so we're starting to use the research that we do in a much more applied sort of sense. And so I think maybe 20 years ago, standardized tests were done kind of, they weren't incorporated in terms of feedback to the school. Schools weren't able to look at them and say, okay, these are the numbers that we have. How can we then use that to improve policies and practices in our school? I think the feds and foundations have all been pushing the education research community to do things that are much more practical in terms of this. Partner with school districts, answer the questions that they really have. I think we've still got a long way to go on that, but helping to make sure that school districts know how to analyze their data or can turn to us to help them, and then use that to remarshal their resources to where they need them, I think is really exciting. It's sort of the best of policy and practice together.
Yeah, I think they're really important and have also been really abused in some cases and ways. And so the worst standardized tests set a very low bar and get people thinking about rote memorization and all sorts of things that I've found heavily problematic in some places. But rigorous tests that actually do critical thinking and all these sorts of things, they're harder to grade because they have essays and things that cost money to get people to grade. And so there tends to be this race to lower standards when you have standardized tests. So I think if you're using them well, you're having rigorous assessments and rigorous standards for students. You're not leveraging that data to say we have an achievement gap because of a set of low achievers. You're really hopefully, which I hope is the next phase of the work and some of the movement around these sorts of things, to take it down to the level of opportunity gap behind that. Because without that, it's really hard to make sense of and can be. That's the reason that the head of the President Obama's My Brother's Keeper initiative brought us in. It was saying there's all this data out there about young men of color getting people to think about underachievement. We need to be talking about excellence and all that's possible. And so I think if they're rigorous and if you're using them to talk about and unpack opportunity gaps, they can be really effective because people didn't know about the types of achievement gaps even as recently as the early 2000s, and prior to that, it was just not well known.
If you don't mind, we could take some questions from the audience now. If there's some hands that go up, we can pass the mic around. Right here.
I had a question for Professor Schanzenbach. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name.
All right, I'm used to it.
Maybe you had it too.
When you were discussing your factor analysis, I couldn't help thinking of Mackey's, I can use an informal term here, concept of twinning, because many of your factors are multivariable, non-orthogonal, and rather approximate because of that. But I was wondering, have you tried twinning for things like organic? I mean, I just as a passing matter, I find it very hard to believe that organic development of the brain stops at age 1. But beyond that, just in terms of trying to fix a variable and twin the rest of them with another group and follow that through time, Mackey did it with traditional versus charter schools, but you could just as easily do it with a different set of twin variables with racial, ethnic, religious, economic, whatever groups, and twin that as you go up through social achievement, and maybe eliminate some of the noise from your numbers. Has anybody attempted to do something like that?
Do you want me to answer that, or do you want to collect a couple and we can sort of answer a group at a time?
Yeah, we can take a couple and do like a group, like a large response. Over here.
I had a question for Mr. Saaris. Am I pronouncing that right? Yeah, that's good. So it was about a data point you had which said that 86% of students of color are not challenged by their classes defined as AP and IB. And I was just wondering what data you collected to get that statistic.
Great. I can answer that one really quickly. We surveyed millions of students across the country and matched it with their academic record.
You collect some more and then we'll
Right
take
here.
a couple.
Hi, my question's also for Reid. Within your theory of change and opportunity, it seems like you're also really interested in civic outcomes, which is something that's pretty hard to measure. So I just wanted to know what type of thinking you're doing around how you can measure how your educational opportunities to AB and IB might be leading to any sort of civic outcomes within your students.
And one more.
Thanks. Thank you guys for coming. For Reid also, how did you decide to that the way you wanted to affect change was through operating schools as opposed to fixing maybe tracked systems within pre-existing schools?
Great question. You
So I can answer this one about sort of different research, approaches to trying to think about the achievement gap. And I think almost any way that you do the comparisons, whether it's sort of a propensity score twinning or whether it's another sort of measurement, you'll find that a substantial amount of the gap that we observe can be explained by observable characteristics, but a substantial amount cannot. And so, the exact breakdown of that is going to vary by which exact, things that you measure. But I think you're never going to get it to go away completely, and that's really, problematic. And there's a large literature on this. A lot of people are taking this very seriously, but we need even more hands on deck to work on this problem because it is just of fundamental importance.
Great, and for our work, we don't operate schools directly ourselves. We're contracted by schools and districts around the country, so it's kind of misleading in our name, I think, is the problem, equal opportunity schools. But we've been hired by 150 public school districts around the country to help them within the existing system is the lion's share of our approach. And then on the civic engagement piece and how we think about it and track that, so it's not core to how we look at things nowadays, but I did, as a part of my thesis that really got me passionate about this area of work, really trace back from this idea from my advisor of measuring political voice through voting, advocacy, volunteerism, all sorts of different types of participation, writing to your congressperson, all these sorts of things, involvement with community organizations. There's a way to sort of sum up those things and measure, hey, somebody has a set of political voice that looks like this, and then did stepwise multivariate regressions to look back and say, what are the factors that are actually leading there? And almost all the variables fall away in comparison to this notion of education as a sorting mechanism that gets somebody to a position where their voice can be heard. And so seeing the vast inequities in education and the vast inequities in political voice, to me it was, to get the civic voice piece, you need to go back to the education piece.
I have time for one more over here on the end.
I just had a quick question about teacher tenure. I haven't heard us mention it much, and I just wanted to know if you thought it was an issue.
I think that there's really good evidence that high-quality teachers make a real difference in their students' lives. And, therefore, I think we need a series of policies and practices that get more high-quality teachers into classrooms with children, especially with disadvantaged children. And to my mind, that might involve tenure reform. It certainly involves pay reform for teachers, and exactly how to do that I think is difficult, but I think the fundamental principle is we need more of our best and brightest in the classroom because we can measure their impact and it's large.
We try to deal with things that are especially politically viable. Focus on things that we can sort of change. But there is an interesting piece in the building on the point here around teacher quality. There was a great Stanford Social Innovation Review article a while back that says assessing an individual's teacher quality and saying they have it or they don't, they're in or they're out, you can actually have a sort of medium quality set of teachers at a school versus a high quality set of teachers at another school, and the medium performing ones can actually be as good or better if they have this added factor of the sort of social capital and the interconnectedness and professional community pieces. And there's arguments to be made that the sort of segmenting out teachers and saying you're good, you're bad, you're in, you're out, can erode that social capital that's needed for a professional environment. So given the policies and the politics of where we are, I think an emphasis on enabling and empowering teachers to work together and learn from one another is really critical.
I want to thank you guys for presenting. I think we all learned a lot. And I want to invite everyone to the reception afterwards. I'm told there will be ice cream. Is that true? Don't blame me if there's not. That's just what I've been told. I'm sure this is a smaller Q&A, so I'm sure if you have extra questions, Diane and Reid will be available during the reception time as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
And if everyone could just join me and thank Ellen Moore and the rest of the events team here at SIEPR for a great job.